right. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Southwestern Indiana Historical Society's lecture this evening. We have a special guest. This is Dr. Michael Strezewski. He is an associate professor of anthropology at the University of Southern Indiana. He has done excavations in New Harmony, as well as outside of Lafayette at Fort Wiyanotten, and some other places as well, but those are two that are near and dear to my heart. Today, though, he's here to talk to us about something a little bit unrelated to that in some ways. So he's going to teach us all about the history of the tavern in New Harmony. So, Mike, I'm going to let you take it away.
Okay. All right, I'll just share the screen here. There we go. How's that look? Good. Okay. So yes, I'm at USI. I'm the archaeology person at USI, and as Jennifer mentioned, I've done a lot of excavations in Indiana. I work primarily in this state. Most people think of archaeology, they don't think of Indiana, but that's my territory. But this talk is not actually about archaeology. It's more of a history sort of talk based on documents rather than digging in the ground and artifacts. And you'll see why that's the case as I go along here. But this is a project that I started working on when I was in Greece visiting my in-laws. My wife's from Greece, and we were visiting the in-laws, and I always like to find something to keep me busy while I'm there. And so what better thing to keep yourself busy with than transcribing 19th century documents, of course, right? But that's, I spent a lot of time working on that, and this is the kind of the fruit of this. Just FYI, I've turned this into a book chapter, and there's an edited volume coming out, hopefully not too much longer, on New Harmony and some of the various aspects of it written by various authors. And I have a chapter in the book on the Harmonist Tavern. So as you can see here, I've called it, an excellent house of private entertainment, the Harmonist Tavern in New Harmony, 1815 to 1825. So we're talking about, of course, the very first settlers in this area, European, that is, of background. Frontier taverns, a little bit about frontier taverns. They varied in quality. Essentially, what we had was a situation in the early 19th century where travelers oftentimes needed a place to stay overnight. The roads were, less than adequate. Sometimes we're talking about a little more than a trail. And if you're stuck in the middle of between point A and point B, in the middle of the, as it's starting to get dark out, you're going to try to find a place to sleep rather than sleeping out under the stars. So frontier taverns were a place where people could stop and find lodging and find some food and some drink for the evening. Now, when we use the term tavern today, we tend to think of just alcohol consumption, but a tavern in the early 19th century is more like what we might call an inn today. It was a place where you could actually sleep as well. Now, these things varied in formality. Usually the ones that are kind of in between destinations. If you had a house along a main road, somebody could just kind of knock at your door at the end of the evening and say, like, knock, knock, I'm looking for a place to stay. Do you have any, can you take in boarders for the night? And they might say yes, and they give you whatever food they have on hand, and then you give them a few, some payment for your stay that evening. Like I said, very informal. And then when you get to some of the larger towns and that sort of thing, you would have like a business that was kind of dedicated to that whole enterprise, where you would actually have a separate room, and there'd be more meals performed served for lodgers, right? So like I said, the accommodations varied greatly in terms of what you could expect from one of these taverns. There's a couple of illustrations I'll show you here of frontier taverns. This is one from a book from 1821, written by a fellow named Adler Welby, who was traveling. It's a travel account type thing. And this is illustration, which he says is Log Tavern, comma, Indiana, right? And then you can see there's a little sign out in front there that says Tavern on the right. And so maybe perhaps this was one that was a bit more of a formal business. This is an illustration by Charles Alexander Lesueur from 1826. This was a tavern operated by a fellow by the name of William Hall in Wamborough, Illinois, which is near Albion in southern Illinois. And you can see it's pretty much just a double wide, not double wide, but double pen log cabin with a porch on the front. Here's a sketch that Lesueur did from the tavern itself, looking out on the landscape, and you can see they've got the table set there, glasses and pitchers and what have you on the table. People getting ready to eat or having just finished eating. It looks rather relaxing. But there's not a whole lot of accounts. Well, there's a fair number, but many of these accounts are not terribly, let's say, flattering in terms of the quality of the accommodations. And I'll give you a few examples here that kind of illustrate that point. This is comments from a fellow by the name of William Foe, who was in Albion, Illinois in 1818. And here's what he had to say about the accommodations. He said, "I supped and went to bed in a hog sty of a room containing 4 filthy beds and 8 mean persons, the sheets stinking and dirty. Scarcity of water, I suppose, the cause. The beds lie on boards, not cords, and are so hard I could not sleep. 3 in one bed, all filth, no comfort, and yet this is an English tavern." The settlers were from England. "No whiskey, no milk, and vile tea in this land of prairies." So, 1 star, right? Basically. Here's another one by Adler Welby talking about English prairie. He said, "Our own fare proved little better than that of our horses, which spoke volumes on the state of the settlement. Some very rancid butter, a little sour bread, and some slices of lean fried beef, which it was vain to expect the teeth could penetrate," right? So, "washed down by bad coffee, sweetened with wild honey, formed our repast. Milk, sugar, salt. The answer to all was, we have none." Now, this one's my favorite one. This is from a tavern near Louisville in Indiana, on the Indiana side. William Foe says, "My hostess would in England pass for a witch, having a singularly long, yellow, haggish, dirty face and complexion. Here is a pet bear." They had a pet bear at the tavern. "One of these pets recently broke its chain and came into the house where lay a sick and bedridden man and an infant child on the floor, which the bear, much pleased, marched off. So the bear grabbed the baby. The poor old man suddenly acquired supernatural strength, sprung out, and running after the bear, threw him down, rescued the screaming babe, unhugged and unhurt, and then jumped into bed again." So, yeah, it sounds like pretty colorful lodgings. And you know what, we may be biased towards descriptions of lodging that were particularly poor. That is, the people who are traveling didn't remark, "Oh, yeah, this was pretty good lodging." They only said something when it was lousy, as you might guess, with from reading reviews today online or something like that. It's kind of the equivalent of that. So now to the Harmonist Tavern in New Harmony. For those of you, if anybody is not familiar with New Harmony, I assume most of you are, but we're talking about a German religious group under the leadership of George Rapp, this fellow shown here. And in Germany, they came up against some persecution as they were in defiance of the Lutheran Church. And eventually decided to emigrate, come to the United States in 1805, where they set up their first town in Western Pennsylvania. Now they, after a period of time there, they decided they were going to move, where they came to what's now Indiana, but at the time was the Indiana Territory. It was a couple of years before statehood. And the first Harmonists arrived in Indiana in 1814. Now, upon their arrival, they started building a town, building facilities for themselves, but one of the things that they realized they needed right away was a tavern. So George Rapp, like I said, the leader of the Harmonists, writes to his adopted son in Pennsylvania saying that they needed a tavern because strangers often come late at night and then we have no bed. We must build a double log cabin for this purpose, right? So they said right away that this is one of the things we absolutely need. So here's the building. This is it. There are some photos. This one's in the USI archives, courtesy of Jennifer. This is a photo of the Harmonist Tavern building in 1903. It's hard to read because I got the zoom controls right over the caption there. But this tavern was considered by a number of people, or was remarked upon as being one of the best ones that they had stayed in Indiana. Here's just a couple of quotes. An excellent house of private entertainment is kept by one of their number named Frederick Eckensberger. He was the tavern keeper, the Harmonist tavern keeper. Everything here was so clean, comfortable, and well arranged that I was quite delighted. You know, it was a big surprise considering what they had come across in other places. Thomas Holm in 1819 said, having refreshed ourselves at the tavern where we found everything we wanted for ourselves and our horses, and all very clean and nice, besides many good things we did not expect, such as beer, porter, and even wine, all made within the society and very good indeed. All right. So what was it like to stay in the Harmonist Tavern? Here's a couple of remarks upon that. Foe says in 1819, I slept in a good, clean bedroom, 4 beds in a room, 1 in each corner, but found bad beef, not a fan of the beef, though good bread and high charges, $1.05 each. So he thought it was a bit overpriced perhaps, but otherwise he thought it was pretty good, it seems. At Welby again in 1819 says, it was neatness itself, but furnished in the very plainest manner, and beyond a 3-cornered armchair, there was not a piece of furniture which could excite the repose of indolence or the indulgence of luxury. After a plain repast, accompanied, however, with some good beer and a bottle of white wine, both the produce of the colony, right? So he thought, you know, everything was a bit plain, but, you know, not bad, clean, comfortable, etc. And to mention here, the Harmonists themselves, the members of the society, did lead very simple lives without any, or very, very few luxuries on their part. And so apparently that ethos kind of extended to the tavern as well for the outsiders. This is a map showing, it's an 1824 map that was drawn by a guy named William Pickering. And this was drafted when the Harmonists were going to sell their town. They decided to sell their town and move back to Pennsylvania. So this was a map that was drafted in order to help the sale of the town. And you can see the tavern located in this portion of the map that I'm showing you, right in the center there. And the tavern is situated pretty much right in the center of town. It's on Main Street and Tavern Street, which is still called Tavern Street, even though the tavern's not there anymore. But it's right at kind of the commercial center of town. You can see to the southeast, you've got the Harmonist store, the warehouse, the doctor's office where Harmonists and non-Harmonists could receive medical care. There's a wheelwright's shop and a blacksmith shop there. These are all places that would be like, you know, point of contact between the Harmony Society and the outside world. You know, generally the Harmonists were rather insular people. They were not, you know, working with outsiders a whole lot. Most of them just didn't even speak English. But this is one of the few places, this kind of sector of town was a place where there was some contact between the society and the outside world, so to speak. This is a map that I just put together using Pickering's map to kind of a little bit better explain as what's going on there. You can see on the bottom right that's the tavern itself, the building, that frame building that I showed you. Just to the west of that is a brick building, 2-story brick building that I don't know the function of. I am going to guess it was probably a couple options, or both perhaps, a kitchen for the tavern, that is where the meals were prepared, and or the residence of Frederick Eckensberger. To the west of that, or to the left, is the stables. And then towards the northwest corner of the lot, you've got a smokehouse and a shed, and then a garden that was used almost certainly to provide produce for meals within the tavern. I don't know the specific use of the different rooms that are shown in the map there. That's not specified at all, but I'm assuming some of them were dedicated to sleeping quarters, eating, food preparation, that sort of thing. All right. Here's a drawing. This is by Charles Alexander Lesueur again. I showed you one of his drawings earlier, a couple of his drawings earlier, and it shows exactly that corner. The Harmonists themselves called it the Wirtshaus, basically a guest house. There was apparently a sign on the building that said it was for private entertainment. I'm pretty sure that sign, or I'm virtually certain that that sign was put out there to keep drunken people out of the tavern. That is, you're here as my guest. If I don't want you here, you can get out. The Harmonists were not fans of drunkenness, and they kind of, as we'll see later, kind of ran into some issues with that sort of thing. Another thing to point out was the Harmonist Tavern was not for Harmonists. They did not drink hard alcohol. They drank beer and wine and that sort of thing, but did not drink hard alcohol. They didn't mix it up with the locals either. So this was purely for outsiders, entertainment and or lodging for those who had official business in town. So what you're seeing here is the tavern itself. Some of the other buildings that we can identify in this drawing, we've got the brick structure that I mentioned that was abutting the tavern. We've got some of the other buildings that are shown on that map, the stable, the shed, and the smokehouse, possibly there, all of those three. And then the school, the Harmonist School, which is across the street, was probably that building that's shown with that other roof, the edge of the roof there. Here's what happened to the tavern. You may ask, is it still standing today? No, sorry, it is not. Unfortunately, it burned down in 1908, taking with it a number of buildings and some residences. So apparently it was described as a devastating fire, but that was what's left of the tavern. So not much. The other question you might have is, well, can you do archaeology on that spot to try to find the tavern or any remains of the tavern or any artifacts related to the use of the tavern? And the answer to that question is probably not in that regard as well. This is the building that currently stands on the tavern lot. And as you can see, that's, you know, pretty substantial construction there, and it almost certainly impacted severely any archaeological remains that are there. There may be some remains related to the smokehouse and perhaps the brick building, but it's all in private hands, and I haven't actually, you know, checked to see if there's anything. It's a bit of a crapshoot to see if you could find anything related to the tavern. So I haven't risked it yet to see if I could find anything. All right, so studying frontier taverns. How are we going to approach this question? Well, we can approach it from an archaeological perspective. That is, you know, you can dig in the ground, find artifacts, you find features related to a tavern, you know, foundation walls and what have you. And so there have been some excavations of taverns done in Illinois. I don't think there's any that have been done in Indiana, but there's some information out there from archaeological sources. As I mentioned just a moment ago, that's not really possible in New Harmony. So that's not much of a chance of doing any archaeology there. The other angle you can take is a historical one that is looking at historical documents related to taverns. So I've given you some information from travelers' accounts and that sort of thing. Those tend to be a bit, as I said, perhaps biased towards negative experiences. You know, there's not all the information there that you could possibly want. You know, you just get, you know, more complaints than anything else. And then the other possibility is if you could find some documents related to the operation of the tavern. That is, if you've got some ledgers or something like that related to tavern operations. There are a few of those out there. There's a few kind of small piecemeal documents here and there for taverns in Indiana, for example, but there's really not a heck of a lot available to sort of piece together what the tavern operation was all about. So when I came across all of the documents for the Harmonist Tavern on microfilm at the Workingmen's Institute in New Harmony, I thought this is a kind of juicy bits of information here that can be used to, you know, really reconstruct what this tavern was all about. So here's what we've got as far as the tavern is concerned. Now, the Harmonists were meticulous record keepers. They kept track of every penny they spent. And this is from the Harmonist ledger for the tavern. And you can see Frederick Eckensberger's name up there at the top. And then you've got a column on the left where it says DR, that's the debit column. And you've got a column on the right, that's the CR, that's the credit column. So that's what we have. We don't have like a list of patrons or how much they paid or, anything like that. It's not everything we could possibly want, but it's a heck of a lot, to be honest. So this is, like I said, when I was in Greece, sitting on the couch, I transcribed all of these documents. And you can see, for example, if you look at the top of this, it says October 19th, and it says 3 pounds of butter and 4 dozen eggs, 70 cents. November 4th, 2 fish, $1. And that says 1 GPBRD. That's 1 gallon of peach brandy. I get to, you look enough at these things, you can begin to figure out what the heck they're all about. But that was $2.25. November 13th, 4 gallons of whiskey for $4. November 14th, 4 pounds of butter at 12.5 cents a pound for 50 cents, that kind of thing. So I went through all these documents and I created a database with all of this information so I could start querying the database to try to find some patterns in what was going on. So what I figured out from doing this is that the last entry in Harmony, Pennsylvania, their first town, was in February 1815. And then the Harmonist Tavern in New Harmony was in operation, or at least the expenses show that it was in operation from June of 1815 through April of 1825, very close to 10 years. And they found there was over 1,000 entries during that time of expenses. And then the tavern switches back to Pennsylvania when they move out of Indiana. And by June of 1825, it's operating back in Pennsylvania again. So we've got a nice little neat 10-year thing, but it pretty much runs the whole span of that 10-year time frame with detailed lists of everything that was purchased. All right, so after crunching the numbers, you start to look for patterns, of course, to start talking about what this tavern was all about and how it was operated. One of the things, kind of basic thing here, was that the tavern had decent business throughout the year. It wasn't a seasonal thing, apparently. There's a little bit of a hump there in the summer, you can see. But, they're doing fairly decent business in, January and March as well. So it was a year-round thing. All right, a little bit about some of the things that were being served in the tavern. Now, what were the most popular drinks at that time? And I'll have to say, first of all, that, the Harmonist Tavern was not your ordinary tavern, operated by a early settler. These were, a religious group. They had their own beliefs about alcohol consumption and who they were going to serve and who they didn't want to serve and all that kind of thing. So we can't really treat it as like a typical tavern for pioneer era Indiana, but nonetheless, it's pretty great information here. One of the things that was being served at the tavern was beer. Now, beer wasn't a big part of American alcohol consumption until after the Civil War. There's issues with, like, you got to keep it cool, the spoilage issues and stuff like that. But the Harmonists were from Germany. They had a beer making tradition and they made beer. And this is an ad actually from the newspaper in Vincennes that shows the beer being, for sale ad in the newspaper there. Now, beer was first offered at the Harmonist Tavern in 1819, and oddly enough, the very first beer for the evidence that I have of the beer being brewed in New Harmony was from mid-1818. So once they started making their own beer, that became the main thing that they were serving in the tavern. They were selling about 457 gallons a year of beer. A heck of a lot of beer being sold. And it was sold for $5 per half barrel. So 16 gallons is a half barrel. And like I said, about $5 per half barrel. The tavern took up about 20% of the society's production of beer, with the remainder sold elsewhere. One year, in fact, in 1820, a large chunk of the beer that was being made in New Harmony was sold to the English Prairie settlement. People from England, they also had a tradition of beer making, beer consumption, and I could trace a large number of the people that were buying beer that year back to the English Prairie, known individuals who were part of that settlement. So that was, they were one of their main customers as far as beer is concerned. Wine was another matter. George Rapp, the leader of the Harmony Society, was a wine dresser. He was involved in the wine business back in Germany. So when he came to the United States, one of the things he wanted to do was to start wine production here in the U.S. And wine was never really a super popular beverage alcoholic beverage in the United States for quite some time. And so there wasn't a huge market for it here. Wine at that time was often served as fortified wine. That is, you would add distilled spirits to the wine to beef up the alcohol content. In the tavern, some of the wine that was sold there is known to have been Harmonist wine. There are some entries where they say H wine, and that's Harmonist wine. They don't specify red or white or anything like that in the ledger, unfortunately, so I don't have any info on that particular question. There are some imported wines that are mentioned. There's one called Tenerife, which is from the Canary Islands. There's Lisbon wine, apparently Portuguese wine. Those were more expensive than the other wines that were being sold. But overall, there wasn't a heck of a lot of wine sold in New Harmony, very modest sales, which says something to the tastes of the local folks, the Posey County residents. They weren't really terribly interested in drinking wine. So it was about 16 gallons per year on average of wine being sold. So again, crunch the numbers, that's only 3.5% that of beer. So much, much less wine than beer. One other thing, and this is, if you know anything about alcohol in the early Republic, cider was a big part of it. And when they say cider in those ledgers, they mean what we would call hard cider, right? As opposed to just, apple juice type cider without any alcohol. Cider was a very popular drink in the early Republic because of there was a glut of apples in this area. Now, what happened was the pioneer folks come to what's now Indiana. They start cutting down trees, planting fields, and one of the things they're planting are apple trees. Now, after a few years, those apple trees start producing lots and lots of apples. Now, what are you going to do with all these apples? Well, roads are terrible. Apples are prone to spoilage. They're heavy. It's going to cost you a lot of money to transport the apples. What am I going to do with all these apples? Well, one thing you could do with them is squeeze them down into apple juice, ferment that, and turn it into cider. So cider was seen also as a patriotic thing to drink because it was locally made stuff, U.S. made beverage, alcoholic beverage. Had about 10% alcohol, a little bit more than beer. Sometimes this was also fortified. That is, like I said, you put distilled spirits into it, and that was oftentimes called cider royal. That shows up on the Harmonist ledgers a couple times. At the tavern, not super popular. Apparently, it was only purchased in 4 out of the 10 years. So some folks were drinking cider, but it wasn't the most popular lower alcohol drink. Now, as we get to the higher alcohol stuff, it's there's a little bit of different story there. Whiskey is the drink of choice when it comes to distilled spirits. It was the biggest selling distilled spirit in the early Republic. And it, depending on how many times you ran it through the distillation process, you could beef the alcohol content up, but it somewhere around 45% or so alcohol in this whiskey. Now, this is not aged whiskey, by the way. This is stuff that's coming out of the distiller and then whisked off to whomever likes to drink it. I'm going to guess it probably tastes more like rubbing alcohol than anything, but so we're not talking about finely aged spirits or anything like that. This one was also seen as a patriotic thing to drink because in this case it was made with locally grown corn, right? So again, lots for farmers. What am I going to do with all this corn? Transportation routes are terrible. Why don't we take this corn and turn it into alcohol? And so it was like I said, a locally made thing. Go US, we're going to drink whiskey instead of rum. Where did rum come from? Well, it comes from molasses and the things that it comes from, which is made in the Indies, East Indies or West Indies, sorry, which is under British control, right? We don't want to support that economy. We want to support our own economy, and so we're going to drink whiskey instead. So what happened was, is you get a huge. Let me just tell you these numbers here first before I go on to the next one. You get a huge glut of whiskey too. So I got some numbers here. So in 1812, now this is 2 years before the Harmonists arrived, in New Orleans, they got 11,000 gallons of whiskey coming down the river, right? That's 1812. By 1816, 4 years later, there was 320,000 gallons of whiskey. And then by 1825, there was 570,000 gallons of whiskey coming down the river to New Orleans. So this was a major product being made in this kind of interior area of the United States, going from 11,000 to 570,000 gallons in only 13 years. So the Harmonists, they made whiskey in Pennsylvania, and when they came here to Indiana, they set up a distillery right away. And this is actually from that Pickering map, shows the distillery. There was two of them actually in town. This is the one on the this is the one on the south side of town, kind of the southwest side of town is where it was located. There's other harder alcohols that are being sold at the tavern. There's some Persico, which is like a peach brandy. There's regular brandy, there's gin, rum, but they're very, very small amounts of these other hard alcohol type drinks. Whiskey is just, number one. Okay, so a few things about whiskey. Whiskey prices drop through time. No big surprise there, right? When the Harmonists first came to Posey County, they were just, they had to buy whiskey. They knew that people wanted it, but they had to purchase it from outside until they got their own stuff running. But there was a lot of demand for whiskey. And you can see when they first came, it was about $1 a gallon, which is a steal for us, but right, $1 a gallon. But the prices continued to go down, 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 down till about 1821. You were getting less than 40 cents a gallon for whiskey. Now here's where we get back to talking about New Harmony specifically. When I started looking at the numbers, there was a very strange pattern that came about. What you can see here in this graph is that the whiskey sales start out rather modest, 1815, 1816. We've got about 50 gallons a year, 1817, even a little less than that. But then by 1818 and 1819, it just goes right through the roof. You've got 200, 250 gallons plus, being sold in those 2 years. And then soon after that, boom, it drops off to basically nothing. So by 1821, 1822, et cetera, there's basically no whiskey being sold at the Harmonist Tavern. Now, I thought by myself, like, what the heck is going on here? Why is it that whiskey is so popular at the tavern and then it just drops off to virtually nothing after that? So I'm racking my brain trying to think about what's going on in New Harmony at that time and what could have been causing that. And I believe I figured it out. I think that the issue there was that there was a riot in New Harmony. And we'll get to the specifics here, but why this relates back to the tavern. So what happened is that in January of 1820, there was a fellow non-Harmonist person named William Harris. He comes into town, gets in a fight with two Harmonists, and Frederick Eckensberger, the tavern keeper, is drawn into the fight. Apparently there was a dispute over some people that were indentured to the Harmony Society, and we don't know any more about the specifics of why the fight occurred. But then the following day, 9 men show up, again, non-Harmonists, show up on the outside of town with clubs, sticks, rifles, guns, and other offensive weapons. And they argue with the Harmonists and they assault 6 Harmonists. And then later that day, 12 men entered the town and they went basically on a riot for a couple of hours, harassing people. And they went to Eckensberger's home at the tavern and threatened him. So after this, there were a bunch of there was charges against the rioters. There was some charges against Eckensberger for assaulting somebody, and it went to the courts. And it got drawn out for a number of months. A couple people paid a small fine, but the main fellow who was involved, William Harris, just didn't show up for court. And after a few months, the charges were dropped. Right. So it didn't really come to much. These people just basically got away with it coming into town and causing a riot in town. So the Harmonist response to this riot was basically one of resignation. They were just, we can't work with these people. These people who are these secular people or these people outside of our society are not going to support us. And they're not thinking the same way we are. We're not going to get proper justice from them. Here's a couple of quotes, and these are related directly to the riot, and this is their response to it. It says, "There's no other way for us than to have as little to do with the world as possible. We just don't want to deal with these people," right? And this is Frederick Rapp, Rapp's adoptive son to John Baker, who's another harmonist. And he said, "We're determined more and more to limit ourselves to ourselves. They're going to turn inward. The world can no longer bear us, and we cannot bear it until it is judged." Right? They were trying to set up a model community in emulation of the early Christians, in anticipation of Christ's return. And they said, these people outside of our society there's something wrong with them. We can't deal with them until it is judged, that is, until Christ returns, right? So I believe that what the solution they thought was best to prevent any kind of further violence and to perhaps limit their contact with some of the people from outside of the society was to cut off hard liquor sales in the tavern. So kind of to back up that assertion, on January 7th, and this is 2 weeks before the riot, they were continuing to buy whiskey. 33.5 gallons of whiskey were purchased at that time. And then February 24th, a month after, about 32 gallons of whiskey was purchased. Now, once those decisions came down in the courts, that was the end of it. No more whiskey was bought. Between March 21st, or March 1821 and April 1825, 4 years, they bought 3 gallons of whiskey, right? So they were going from like hundreds of gallons every year to 3 gallons for a 4-year period. So it was, cold turkey, basically. They were not going to sell whiskey anymore in the town. Now, you may ask, do they continue to make whiskey? Absolutely. The wine or the whiskey production never diminished. I don't have all the numbers. I haven't got all the documents to show exactly how much whiskey was being made, but they didn't slow down as far as I can tell, right? Here's a letter from Frederick Rapp to one of the people who was inquiring about purchasing some whiskey. And he said that there's an uncommon call for whiskey during a harvest by our neighbors. Apparently the neighbors needed a lot of whiskey to harvest their crops, whom we could not refuse without offense, so that all the new whiskey is now sold to the barrel, right? We got nothing to sell to you because the locals have bought it all, right? So the thing is that, they didn't have any qualms about selling whiskey, per se. They just didn't want anybody drinking it in town because they thought it was causing conflicts and it was just something they just didn't want to deal with. And so the tavern itself cut off all hard liquor sales, right? Now, as further kind of confirmation of this whole idea, once the Harmonists moved back to Pennsylvania in 1825, whiskey sales started right up again, right? 1825 was a partial year. They didn't start till June. They sold 73 gallons of whiskey. 1826, the next year, the first full year in Pennsylvania, 180 gallons of whiskey. So not a problem selling whiskey to people in the tavern as long as they behaved themselves. And apparently that was the biggest issue. They just couldn't control the Posey County folks in the tavern, right? Now, the bottom line of this is that the profits of the tavern suffered, right? As you might guess, because people wanted whiskey. There's no whiskey at this tavern. Why would I go to that tavern, right? They don't allow drunkenness. They don't allow this. They don't allow that. I'm just going to go somewhere else. So you can see that the profits of the tavern continue to go up from 1815, 16, 17, 18, 19. And then after 1820, when there's that riot, starts to go down through 1823. I don't have any numbers for 1824 and 25, so I don't know ultimately what the profits were for those last 2 years, but you can see a clear pattern there of declining sales or declining profits at the Harmonist Tavern, which I think is almost certainly due to hard feelings between the locals, coupled with the fact that they weren't selling whiskey anymore. They weren't giving the people the product that they were asking for, right? And that's not, it's not, the bottom line is not good for business, right? When you're not giving people what they ask for. So that's sort of the gist of it, and the main arguments I've made in this chapter. And I am perfectly willing to take any questions you might have regarding the Harmonist Tavern. So thanks for having me for doing the talk today.
Does anyone have any questions? Do you know where they were selling the whiskey they were making that wasn't going to the tavern?
Some of it was going to the tavern. A lot of it was being sold elsewhere. I haven't dived into all of the whiskey and beer sales records. There's a lot out there. I mean, if you ever look at the Harmonist records in the Workingmen's Institute, there's like 40 reels of microfilm, literally, and thousands of pages of documents related to sales of this and that. Surprisingly, a large amount of it's in English, which is good for me, of course. But I haven't gone to that extent to find everything related to liquor sales. It's really complicated to try to nail all that stuff down.
Yeah,
But
not a lot of keyword searching happening with microfilm. Yeah, we do have a question in chat.
Okay.
Do you think the riot was about slavery, since the Harmonists were abolitionists and most of their neighbors were not?
Slavery. I don't know. The Harmonists, they had a few members who were African American people, the former slaves that they brought in. They weren't terribly vocal about slavery, as far as I know, one way or the other. I don't think it had anything to do with that. I mean, it was some kind of like I said, indentured servitude related argument. Another thing that the people were commonly didn't like the Harmonists for was the fact that they operated businesses and they took in all this money from the local economy, and they didn't have to pay any workers because they kept it all in the society, and they never gave any of it back. And in this, like, in the frontier era, there was this kind of ethos of like helping one another and that sort of thing. And the Harmonists, I think, were perceived as kind of not playing the game correctly. They were hoarders of money. Plus, they had some weird beliefs, right? They were celibate. They were followers of this weird old man with the beard, right? And there was a lot of thought that a lot of travelers remarked that they were basically like, slaves to this fella who told them what to do, and they just did whatever. They were countering this, like, this freedom, individuality sort of ethos that was really common on the frontier. And so, yeah, they just ran into a lot of problems, both economically and, I've told people before, and you may agree with me, Jennifer, that, if the Harmonists were around today, a lot of people would call them a cult. That term that's kind of used is for an aberrant sort of religious group or something like that, that has this charismatic leader, right? And we don't know what's going on behind closed doors, some strange things going on there. And so there was a lot of
succession plan.
Sorry?
I mean, there was no succession plan.
No.
Father Rapp never said Frederick will take over the community when I die.
Yeah, and then Frederick died before he did. So, yeah. I mean, they eventually carried on, but by the time Rapp died, it was already petering out, and they didn't really have any new members, or very few new members in it.
So, as I know, they did not invest much in the immediate community, but they were fairly big contributors to Indiana politics. They were against statehood.
Yeah, I don't know specifically about the statehood issue.
So
I
they
do.
must have been supporters of Harrison, who also was not really in favor of statehood.
I don't recall specifically about that. One thing I do know about politics in the Harmonists, though, is that there was some conflict between the Harmonists and the locals because it was perceived that the Harmonists were voting as a block, that they were just slavishly doing whatever rap told them to. Like, here, you're going to vote for this one, this one, this one, this one. And then they would be able to sway elections that way. And they thought it was unfair to whomever wasn't, the favored candidate of the Harmonists, that they had a large chunk of Posey County population at that time, and they were able to, get people elected that they wanted rather than make it a fair election. So I know that was an issue. About statehood, I don't remember anything specifically about that.
Well, I know I've read some things that said they were
It's
not keen
possible, I
on
just don't recall.
statehood.
Yeah.
But even after statehood, they contributed to political campaigns.
Yeah,
So
I don't doubt.
they wanted to be left alone.
Yeah, they wanted people in place who were going to give them what they wanted, which was, basically to be left alone, and conduct their business without being harassed, that kind of thing. And it's one of the reasons why they left. I think we don't know all the specific reasons, but one of them, I don't doubt at all, had to do with the fact that they were not getting along well with their neighbors.
Yeah, I think that was a strong indicator as well. Although I guess it's interesting that they did continue to sell whiskey even when they went back to Pennsylvania.
Yeah. They had no problem with whiskey. They were out just kind of counting the pennies and what's the bottom line. They didn't smoke, they didn't drink hard alcohol, but they really had no issue with selling things like that.
Well, whiskey is relatively cheap to produce.
Yeah.
You just need space.
Yeah, and water.
And wood. And we got lots of wood in this time period anyway.
Yeah, they had 2 distilleries operating. So apparently they thought it was worth their while to, have production really ramped up.
All right. Any other questions for Mike? Because I could sit here and talk Harmony Tavern all night long. Thank you so much, Mike, for telling us all about the new Harmony Tavern. And we have one more presentation for this season, which will be next month. And that is Bill Bartell is going to be presenting on young Abraham Lincoln. Is that correct, Vivian?
Yes.
I know I didn't get the title exactly right. And that'll
Abe's
be our
Youth, Shaping the Future President is what was given to me.
There you go. Abraham Lincoln, that Indiana boy. Inside joke. Yeah, thank you very much, everybody. And I will be